tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Freelance journalist Justin Ling set out in a new report called Far and Widening, the Rise of Polarization in Canada, which you can see there, and it comes out tomorrow, to identify some of the root causes of this. And he actually does quite a formidable job with this. He talks about partisan sorting, which we'll get into in a moment. He talks about the online ecosystem. He mentions True North, not entirely in a favorable way, so we'll talk about that as well. And he also talks, of course, about the pandemic, which has inflamed many of these polarizations and polar tensions in Canadian politics. Now, I should say, Justin Ling is a guy with whom I've had several disagreements, but I've always had, whenever I've interacted with him, very civil and positive exchanges. And he was the only journalist outside of conservative media to actually interview me about my book on his podcast when it came out, which I was and remain very appreciative of. And I wanted to return the favor now that Justin has put out this report. Justin Ling joins me now. Justin, it's good to talk to you, and I will say congratulations on doing this. I know it's quite a lengthy piece, and I know it was something you worked on for many months. So thanks very much, and well done.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. There was a reason why I picked your show as one of the first interviews we were going to do about this thing. So I'm excited to get into it.
Let's, before we get into the meat of this, explain what your research question is and also what your definition of polarization is, because I know it's one of those things that even in academic literature on political polarization can have a number of meanings.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. I mean, going into this report, the idea was not to come up with any big solutions. It was not to sort of assign blame necessarily. It really was supposed to be a diagnostic, right? Like an audit of the state of polarization in Canada to understand the drivers, the variables, and the factors that was contributing to our sense of polarization. Or, I mean, maybe we went into it kind of wondering, are we going to find out that polarization is really not as bad as we all kind of think it is? So from the outset, definitions were really hard. So much of the academic literature is about the US. And in the US, it's really easy to measure, right? Because you ask people, how do you feel about Donald Trump? How do you feel about January 6th? How do you feel about the COVID vaccines? How do you feel about abortion access? Whatever, right? All of those policy issues, you can actually watch not just the divide between the two poles, but the movement that occurs when, say, Donald Trump comes out pro or against something, or Joe Biden comes out pro or against something. You know, you actually see Republicans shift significantly when Donald Trump pronounces against a certain issue. So on all of those fronts, it's really easy to measure south of the border. Here, we don't really have that, right? We have that liberal consensus, broadly speaking, on abortion access, on LGBTQ rights, so on and so forth. Even if there's a divide, the divide stays pretty static, right? So we kind of work to look at a whole bunch of other metrics. There's a little bit of academic research. I won't go too far into it. Suffice it to say, we are seeing the demonization of political opponents, the appeals to identity over policy or issues. We're seeing starker divides when it comes to the actual political sphere. We're seeing an inability to talk to each other on major issues. And we're seeing instances of mass civil demonstration that gets sort of unruly. And that goes everywhere from the Freedom Convoy right down the line to basically the violence that's occurred in Nova Scotia around the livelihood fishery for Mi'kmaq fishers. So we're seeing all of the symptoms of polarization, and I'm feeling really comfortable saying that it's here and it's quite bad. And by all the polling data we have, Canadians tend to agree.
One of the interesting bits of research that you shared that I find is a useful reflection of this problem was how people define their political opponents and how people think the political outgroup is comprised. And the one that I think the examples you gave from the research you cited was that, you know, conservatives tend to think there are a lot more gays in the Liberal Party, and liberals think there are a lot more unvaccinated people in the Conservative Party, and both are overinflations. But it actually shows that people do have, whether intentionally or not, kind of a caricaturish version of what the other political group is.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this research comes from Eric Merkley at the University of Toronto. He's actually used there's these surveys that get done. They're kind of like exit polls
Mhm.
after every major federal election. It's probably the best trove of data we have about how Canadians feel about the political scene. And he's used that data to actually chart the ways in which Canadians are growing increasingly disaffected and alienated towards our political parties. And he's basically said the data shows that we are trending towards the current state of politics in the U.S., the animosity Democrats feel for Republicans and vice versa. So you're totally right. Partisans in this country increasingly see partisans of the other stripe as alien or foreign, in some cases as working against the best interests of the country, and seeing them as sort of laboring under a moral defect in many ways. And it's not hard to figure out why this is. You go back 20, 30 years and you had real competition and diversity inside political parties, right? Inside the Progressive Conservative Party, there was a pro-free trade side, there was an anti-free trade side. Ditto for the Liberal Party. Going
Mhm.
back to the early 2000s, the Liberals had a social conservative caucus, right? The NDP had a pro-gun caucus inside of their party, and what that meant was that you could see within your own party elements of your opponents. It was a lot easier for New Democrats to identify with conservatives because they also had a rural base, right? They also had rural voters, hunters and fishers and so on. So you could look across the aisle and say, okay, I might not agree with them on things. I might think their vision for the country is bad. But at the very least, I understand where they're coming from because the guy sitting next to me, or the guy who has the conservative sign down the street, thinks a lot like they do, or thinks a lot like I do. So the decline of that, the kind of collapsing in of our political parties has made this much worse. We no longer really have diversity in our parties. In fact, identifying with the party across the way is seen as a problem that needs to be kind of rooted out of your party. There's no longer really, I mean, maybe the Conservative Party might be the last kind of big-ish tent, but even still, it's gotten a lot smaller. There's no ideological diversity in the Liberal Party. There's no real ideological diversity in the NDP. And even the Conservatives, identifying or agreeing with the Liberals or NDP on anything is seen as a huge problem, and sort of a surrendering of the conservative ideals. And all of this makes any form of cooperation, collaboration, conversation really difficult.
I agree with what you've just identified there, but there's a contradictory problem I find that also exists, which is that you have people on the left and the right that increasingly don't even see distinctions between political parties anymore. And I think the pandemic was an example of that. I mean, you often hear in the US the term brought up, the uniparty, which is the idea that, the Democrats and the Republicans are all part of one uniparty. And I know that we'll get into, some of the conspiratorial stuff that I know you write a lot about. But I'm wondering how that factors in, because in the COVID era, as you've talked about in your report and as I've discussed on my show, there was actually very little tolerance for distinctions between political parties in the early stage. I mean, we even heard Aaron O'Toole talk all about the so-called Team Canada approach, and Andrew Scheer at the time when he was the leader. And at that point, it was like political opposition was stigmatized. And you had MPs that even said that they were worried of criticizing the government because they didn't want it to feed into something that was adverse to public health measures.
Yeah, I even include a little bit from a study that was done in Quebec in the early version, or the early part of the pandemic, where they observed exactly this phenomenon, where a total lack of criticism and lack of competition, really, in the political sphere and the media. They extend this so far as to talk about the media as well. The lack of criticism of government policies actually fomented distrust amongst many people who were a little skeptical to begin with. And then when partisanship returned, it made everything all that much more worse. So you're right that sometimes a lack of competition, or a kind of a view that all the parties are the same, also foments this problem. The reality is polarization is happening in different directions at the same time. Partisans are one part of the problem. People who are kind of outside, maybe alienated from the political game, are another part of the problem. And when I say problem, I don't mean they are the problem themselves, but all of these things are contributing to the problem of polarization, as are the kind of broad middle of the country who are frankly, I think, a little fed up with the entire process, and who to be honest with you, often kind of buy into the idea of the wedges being used in the political sphere. And in the report, I certainly chide Justin Trudeau for weaponizing some of those wedges, as I chide Pierre Poilievre for weaponizing wedges in the opposite direction. So you're totally right that a perceived or a real lack of debate on some of these issues also contributes to this problem. And there is a significant class of people who have unplugged from politics in this country, or who have opted for, frankly, conspiracy theories and misinformation to sort of explain this apparent consensus that's happening in our political realm.
Yeah, and you have a line that I'll quote here, where you're talking about the two groups on COVID, the COVID narrative, if I can use that in a neutral way here, the trusting and the skeptical. You say each considered the other side to be selfish, misinformed, and misguided, but one side had the support of political leaders, the health establishment, and the media. The other, lacking a viable democratic outlet for their grievances, decided to head to the Capitol to make their voices heard. And of course, you're talking about the Freedom Convoy. You and I think we're seeing very different things when we were looking at the convoy, and I think we should have a discussion about that at some point. But I would be interested in hearing if you think that what happened from that point on only furthered that, because I saw people that were consumers of convoy coverage in the media that for the first time in their lives were saying, you know what, I'm swearing off the CBC, I'm swearing off the Globe and Mail, because I don't trust them anymore. So if there had been up until, January of 2022, a growing frustration or a growing level of disenfranchisement, when the convoy came, it was really as though a flip switch for a lot of people. And they said, I no longer trust anything that's happening in that establishment realm, be it from politics or media.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's 100% the case, and I think it's really too bad for a variety of reasons. And it's not, and the mainstream media is not entirely without blame either, right? So there was some bad coverage of the Freedom Convoy, and I won't pretend like all my coverage was 100% spot on either. I think
I'll just interrupt there and say that a lot of the issues that my audience will have, we dealt with on Justin's podcast.
Yeah,
so you can go and read that at his Substack. So if you're like, why are you talking? Because we've already done that part. So we can move on now, but carry on. I just wanted to put that on there for people to look up.
No, I appreciate it. Because the thing is, some people were right to be frustrated, but I will also say the sort of in-group, out-group thing, the constant need to be with your people, right? The people who, let's say, agreed with the convoy, or the people who were just angry and furious and wanted to crack down on even harder. The sort of divide that occurred between those sides made it really hard to see on the multiple fronts on which both sides actually probably agreed on a ton of things, right? Like, I always tried to have this conversation with people, whether it was around the Freedom Convoy or whatever. I was against lockdowns, right? Like, I live in Quebec. We had a curfew. Nothing made me angrier through the pandemic than being told by my government that I have to go inside at 8 p.m. every night. That made me crazy. It made all my friends crazy. It made a whole bunch of liberals and progressives and lefties and conservatives and libertarians. It made everyone in this province crazy. And there was not enough debate about it in the media. And sometimes it felt like there was the conspiracy of silence in the media to criticize the total lack of scientific evidence behind that policy. And I know when I went to Ottawa to cover the Freedom Convoy, a ton of Quebecers were there protesting the same thing. Unfortunately, the thing that ultimately, set the dividing line between us was feelings around the vaccine. I'm aggressively pro-vaccine. I think the science supports them. Other people disagree. How do we figure out a way in which we can put aside some of those big things we disagree on and focus more on the things that we can actually have a conversation on? The fact is, we can't have a real conversation about vaccines. There is just too much pollution in the space. There's too much misinformation out there. I know people might disagree with me, and that's fine. But it's also over now. We're past that. Let's focus on the things where at least we can have a reasonable, rational conversation about these policies. And I think that's fundamentally the path forward here. It's going to require us to have a conversation about all of this, ideally in the form of a real public inquiry where we all get to come out and kind of air these grievances, have that moment, that difficult conversation, then move on and figure out the bridges that we can find that allow us to have those conversations again, that also allow us to hopefully, reopen those channels between people who don't trust the CBC anymore, but also between the CBC and the mainstream press, and maybe things like True North or other alternative, conservative minded outlets. Because I think this pulling away over these frankly, now relatively insignificant matters of disagreement is a real problem. The convoy has been a year in the rearview mirror. Let's stop letting that dictate what news media we listen to, or which politicians we trust or don't trust. It's going to require a bit of a wiping of the slate clean and trying to kind of rebuild this all over again. Because if we keep letting those divides grow, I know this sounds a little bit, rose glasses optimistic, but if we keep letting those divides grow, things are going to get worse, and we're going to continue having conversations that have nothing to do with each other, and we're going to continue seeing the other side as foreign and alien and different and hostile. And it's only through having those conversations that we're going to learn they're not that different. They're a lot like us, and they agree on many of the important things.
But I think what you've said there contributes in not an intentional way, but contributes here to the problem, because the people that felt most aggrieved by lockdowns and vaccine mandates and all of these things are not really willing to move on from it, because for them, and you can understand it. I mean, you had people that lost their decades-long careers out of this, people that could not spend time with dying family members. And I know you know this, and I know you're critical of a lot of the measures that as you just indicated there. But the thing is that there's a lot of resistance to this idea of just moving on from one particular group. So here's an example of a divide where, Justin Ling says, listen, we can all just agree this was an aberration. Let's move on. You've got someone else that for whatever reason says, no, I can't move on. I want accountability. I want justice. I want some form of recompense for this. How do you square that divide when people may be not able to agree on the severity of what happened?
I mean, I think that's what a public inquiry gets you. Like, I know there's a citizens inquiry going on, I think still going on right now, that I frankly don't think is the best avenue for this. It's time the government, the provinces, whoever, get together and have a real conversation about the pandemic and whether or not the measures we put in place were effective or were not effective. I tend to think.
So you don't think we need to just sort of close the book and not look at it again?
No. Like I said, I think a public. I think I put it right there in the report. One of the solutions about going forward has to be a public inquiry, right? Like, it has to be a chance for everybody to get in the same room or on the same Zoom or whatever it is, and kind of air those grievances so that we can move forward. That has to be the step we do before we move forward. That being said, part of living in a democratic society is saying, yeah, I was really unhappy the way this policy affected me. I was really unhappy the way in which this government regulation impacted my life, my livelihood, or whatever. But then going, I have to compromise. I have to let stuff go at some points, right? Like, and I appreciate there's still some raw emotions there, and I appreciate there's still some people who do want that recompense, but also we got to move on. We got to figure a way to kind of get back to working together, because the other part of all of this, sometimes we talk about polarization as though it's just some sort of ephemeral problem that we just have to kind of clean out of the air. We'll all be fine. Part of the thing driving polarization is that we have a real problem of state capacity. There are things in this country that are falling apart. There are huge problems facing us. And some of those problems became very clear during the pandemic. Some of those problems, I think, fed into a lot of the mental health challenges that people experienced during the pandemic. It fed into a lot of the economic problems we faced during the pandemic. And I think if we're still bickering about things that happened 2 years ago, we're going to have a really hard time figuring out any sort of consensus or cooperation that lets us fix those very real problems that are still hurting our cities and our country and our livelihood and our families and so on.
One of the most interesting quotes that you included in your report here came from a Trudeau government official who said they saw a moral imperative. And that's the direct quote there, a moral imperative to push back against some of the anti-vaccine rhetoric. And you actually take from that a quote that I'll read here, where you say that in practice, this meant turning vaccine status into a moral electoral wedge issue during a snap election in the midst of a pandemic. Now, I would say, and I'm curious if you agree or disagree, that the Liberals weaponized the vaccine issue far more than the Conservatives did, far more than the media did, because I really feel that, look, Trudeau looked and saw that 80% of the country was vaccinated. People who were unvaccinated were a statistical minority. And it seemed like a relatively low stakes game to start winning votes from the 80% at the expense of the 20. And I think the trucker mandate was a great example of that. It served no public health benefit. It really seemed to be adding insult to injury. But I'm curious. So first off, I'm curious for your thoughts on that, but also that moral imperative, because I don't know if this was I don't know the tone in which this was said to you. Was this a Liberal staffer kind of talking about, we really wanted to stick the knife in, or was it just a crusade that really existed outside of science in their view?
So okay, so let me say I generally agree, for at least for that first year and a half or so, coming up to the end of the 2021 election. Yes, the Liberals were the ones who were weaponizing the pandemic for political ends. I don't know how you can come to any other conclusion. Aaron O'Toole and Jagmeet Singh and Yves-François Blanchet did their part of all standing together and trying to be those cooperative political figures to say, yes, please go get vaccinated. They're safe. Put political differences aside and go get this vaccine that all available evidence says is safe. And it was Justin Trudeau who decided to go on TV and say anti-vaxxers, not all of them caveat, but tend to be misogynists and white supremacists and so on and so forth. And he even goes so far as to say Aaron O'Toole is not as strong on vaccines. Yves-François Blanchet is not as strong on vaccines. And I think that was really deplorable. And I don't think we haven't had enough, at least in I'll say the mainstream press, the liberal press, whatever you want to call it, enough of a conversation about how dangerous those comments were and how bad they were. And I don't think it was only the benefit of hindsight that I think I've really appreciated just how terrible they were. I think when you get into 2020, when the Freedom Convoy shows up and Pierre Poilievre launches his leadership bid, I think you can absolutely say that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party weaponized, in many cases, misinformation or distrust around the vaccines for their own political ends. Maybe you could even say in response to what Trudeau did. I don't think there's anyone with totally clean hands here in this whole thing, but Justin Trudeau, as the Prime Minister, had a moral obligation to not play this game. He probably had a moral obligation not to call an election in the midst of the pandemic and use that pandemic as a political wedge. I don't think we can stress that enough. So absolutely. When it comes to their moral imperative to highlight the anti-vaxxers, it was very much set in the tone, and I genuinely think they believe it, that it was the Prime Minister's job to be forceful in recommending people take the vaccine. And by that I mean, really underscoring the possible dangers of not doing it, underscoring the safety of taking it, and admonishing anybody who could contradict that. I think we know emphatically, even if their intentions were pure, that doesn't work. People don't like that. That actually pushes people in the opposite direction. You get people who are skeptical to do something that they're skeptical of by addressing their concerns directly and talking to them about it, not by going on TV and calling them a bunch of lunatics, right? There's no doubt there's people out there who are spreading wild lies like, the COVID vaccine is full of snake venom or it's rearranging your DNA. Like, these things we know are not true. Mm-hmm. I don't know what you do with those people, but there was a ton of people out there who were ranged from skeptical to hostile. Maybe some of them could have been convinced. Maybe some of them would never be convinced. Regardless, you do better by having genuine conversations with them and not calling them idiots than you do by going on TV and calling them a bunch of angry women-hating nutjobs.
And this gets back into what I think is the most crucial point of your report, which is the idea of echo chambers and how it's increasingly comfortable to be in one. And I'm fully aware of this. And this is actually I don't want to say an uncomfortable topic, but it's a challenging one for me because I realize that independent media that takes a particular political stand will naturally gravitate towards people that like echo chambers. And I always try to do my best to push back against that by saying, I don't want you to just listen to me and only me. I want you to do what I do and get news from a variety of places. But we are very siloed, and it's actually fascinating to me. I once did a little experiment where I logged into a friend's Facebook account who wasn't political. This was back when Facebook had news. And I just wanted to see, your homepage, my homepage, just how different is what we're getting. And wildly different, just so wildly different. And if you were someone that didn't quite know how these programs worked, you wouldn't realize that you're only getting a narrow subset of the world whenever you go online. And I'm curious if you think people are choosing these. People are saying, I am self-selecting out of the world and I want my little slice of it. Or do you think people are ending up in this and don't even know it?
This is a terrible question because I've been writing my newsletter for tomorrow for the launch of the report on exactly this topic, and so I have 3,000 words in my head that I'm trying not to dispute you. The short answer is Yes, people chose it, but they were also pushed into it. The reality is, we actually know from a bunch of really good social science, people are not naturally inclined to just consume things that they agree with from people they agree with. We're actually very much more complicated creatures. We tend to go out of our way to get information that contradicts our worldview,
Hmm.
or at the very least tends to be a little bit oppositional to it. And this has been the history of people since the dawn of time. I mean, I hosted a podcast about right-wing radio, and found myself not being 100% against all of it, right? Like, I can't, I have to confess, Rush Limbaugh is really fun to listen to. And then through doing this show, I talked to a bunch of people who are generally liberals, who would say the same thing, would turn on Rush Limbaugh because they wanted to hear the other side, even if they disagreed with it. We are naturally predisposed to being curious, weird creatures who want to hear the other side. Now, Facebook Facebook was the instigator, but not the only culprit for this. Facebook consistently tried to convince us that we didn't want that, right? Facebook
Hmm.
consistently tried to give us information that it thought we wanted, information that we agreed with, information that people like us liked. And consistently, we actually have a bunch of internal Facebook memos that were leaked last year to Congress, that show that people don't like it. People were unhappy with it. The problem is, Facebook earned more money and got more engagement by continuing to do it. In some cases, by making us angry. It actually convinced publishers and political parties by using anger as the most powerful metric to share information on that news feed, by juicing it up in the algorithm. It convinced political parties and news outlets to make their headlines angrier. You can see, I mentioned this stat in my report, but you can see a 300% increase in the number of headlines that use anger and fear and anxiety in their headlines. At the same time, you see a massive decline in headlines and news articles that generally employ happiness and joy and positive emotions, right? So Facebook directly contributed to the mainstream press, by the way. This is not even the alternative press. This is the major news outlets, to them becoming angrier and more oppositional, right? So that led to a catalyst of a whole bunch of startups replicating that emotion, right? That's where you get a lot of the Breitbarts. It's where you get the Press Progresses and the Daily Coast and these other outlets that tend to use this high emotion language. Watch Joe Biden destroy Bernie Sanders. Watch Donald Trump eviscerate Ron DeSantis. This is where you get that language from. And even if we're not naturally predisposed towards that kind of stuff, if you keep pushing it in people's faces, they will consume it, right? Because it sounds exciting. And if you're in this rage arms race to make everything this high emotion competition, people will engage with it. And the problem is, we've done this now for so long. We have not tried anything different. We've baked in this angry, rage-inducing media culture, and now we don't know how to get out of it, right? The old publishers are dying. They're now facing a huge distribution problem because social media is discouraging them. They're having a hard time recruiting subscribers. They're losing their print subscribers, so on and so forth. And C18 is making everything so much worse. Meanwhile, alternative media outlets like yours, like the National Observer, like the Rebel, you name it, are speaking to their own crowd, and no one's quite sure how to do that cross-cutting conversation like we used to have. No one's quite sure how to get someone to buy a copy of the New York Times and then go listen to Rush Limbaugh in their car. We are at a real problematic point right now, and it's only going to be through people kind of waking up to this and going, oh God, you're right, I have to find something to listen to that isn't what I always listen to. And that's going to be part of the solution, but it's going to be a tough slog for the next little while.
And it is interesting because I like, in theory, what you're saying, that we're not as inherently tribal on these things. I'm a bit skeptical. I mean, I remember when you had me on your podcast, you were very kind enough to withstand the deluge of, oh, how are you dignifying this guy? Why are you having him on? And I'm sure my commenters may return the favor. But I mean, even last week, I had a self-professed Marxist on the show named Stuart Parker, and we had a nice chat. And he's, all over the leftist causes on everything except one, which is the transgender issue. And I even with that had people that were commenting, being like, I won't hear anything this Marxist has to say, because there is sort of that natural instinct of, I just want to hive off these perspectives. Now, I think that's probably a minority. I think, people seem to be enjoying so far the conversation you and I are having, and I'm glad we're having it. And I don't know if that's enough to
Yeah.
right this ship, because there is a psychological component to this, and that's the worst thing, is that you're talking about things that have very real effects on people's brains in what they choose to click on and what they choose to engage with, and I don't know, and it's bigger than your report here, but I don't know what you need to unwire that.
No, I don't 100% know either. I mean, I think step one is really measuring it and auditing it, which was the point of this report. We really don't get into solutions, really. Part of the point of this report is to grab it, look at it, recognize it, how it's happening in your life, maybe see some of it in some of your own behavior, and to start thinking about it, and then be receptive to solutions or be thoughtful about them. Personally, I have a few ideas, right? Like I think political party financing is part of the problem. The constant demand that parties raise huge amounts of money is part of what's making us crazy. I heard conservative MPs who were shocked to hear the words come out of their mouth, who said, I think it's time to bring back the per vote subsidy, right? We can't keep shaking down all of our supporters for money constantly in order to fight elections. Ditto. I heard those conservative MPs say, God, it might be time for proportional representation. First past the post is Justin Trudeau has mastered first past the post. He has perfected the way in which to squeeze the NDP, stoke up fears about the Conservatives, and kind of balance in the middle, right? Like, he's really good at it. Proportional representation, alleviating some of that pressure on the Conservatives from the right by letting Maxime Bernier win like 7 seats or whatever, letting the NDP kind of a little more breathing room on the left. All of that might actually help reinvigorate our democracy to some degree, but those aren't solutions either. I mean, those won't fix polarization overnight. It's also going to require a rebuilding of state capacity, which is bigger than any of us can kind of do individually. We need to be able to get, the homelessness problem under control. We need to be able to build housing again. We need to be able to build new transit, to get stuff done again. And that is a much deeper problem than kind of any one policy can solve. And I think once you see things kind of rebounding properly, people will get less anxious and more inclined to having kind of real conversations with people. So you're totally right. I mean, this is a much, much bigger problem. But I think it's also going to be a future of the internet thing, right? Like, where we're at right now, we don't have a platform for conversations anymore. Twitter has not that it was great before. Frankly, I think it's even worse now. And people decamping to their various kind of preferred social media platforms is not really enabling us a space to sit in the middle and talk anymore. So I don't know where that is. We're going to have to figure it out because, unless we can actually talk to each other again, get used to hearing people you disagree with kind of actually explain themselves in real terms. I think it's going to be really important and really necessary going forward.
Yeah, and just on that, I mean, your report identifies how deplatforming, which has often, in my experience, been viewed as a predominantly left-wing phenomenon that's used against right-wingers, although I know that I'm simplifying it, but how deplatforming actually drives this further and actually forces people into their own little echo chambers. And I was actually, just on a related note, kind of encouraged that some of the people you spoke to had a very, I would say, enlightened view of cancel culture that isn't what I expected from the under 35s. They were almost universally, it seemed like, from what you included, against it.
Yeah, I mean, part of the report, we had a particular focus on the experiences of youth. We did some polling, particularly in amongst youth who don't normally respond to polling. But we also had these kind of long form roundtables where kind of focus groups where we talk to under 35-year-olds about their experiences with polarization and politics more generally. And we actually had no questions in there about cancel culture or deplatforming or anything, because we really didn't. We wanted to let the conversation drive itself, but also it really wasn't part of the study. It was something all of them volunteered. We heard it again and
Wow.
again and again. And it was really interesting because, I might disappoint some of your listeners. It's not like there was some huge upswell of conservative sentiment amongst these youth. A lot of them are progressives, right? A lot of them are, talking about homelessness as one of the biggest problems in this country, the desperate need for affordable housing, racial justice as being one of the top priorities, Indigenous reconciliation, all these things. But what they told us was that the constant demands from their peer groups around kind of being ideologically perfect, around denouncing the right people, around never kind of questioning orthodoxy, was making them anxious and slightly crazy, right? Like, there was a feeling like cancel culture and deplatforming as a tactic had run contrary to the principles on which it was founded, right? The hope of cancel culture and deplatforming was it was supposed to respond to inadequacies of the state and the media to deal with, sexual predators and abusers and all this, the Harvey Weinsteins of the world or the Jeffrey Epsteins or whatever. But what they found was that it was increasingly targeting either middling celebrities or public figures or whoever for whom the punishment was much worse than the crime, or in even worse cases, people in their community, right? We always talk about cancel culture as being this kind of big national thing, but where it actually happens more often than not is in small communities. One person says something slightly untoward, makes kind of an ignorant comment, or gets accused of something, and it spirals out of control, and suddenly their lives are ruined. And not only that, everybody else in the community is sort of pressured upon to stand up and denounce that figure, or else be kind of labeled a traitor to the revolution to some degree, right? So a lot of these people we spoke to basically said, I agree with the principles underpinning it. I do want to call out, guys who are sexually harassing people on the job or whatever, but I feel like we've wasted a lot of time and energy destroying people who didn't necessarily need to be destroyed, and not, most importantly, giving them a path to sort of rehabilitation and for reform and apology and penance and reconciliation. And I think that was really interesting. And I kind of extend this out in another part of the report to talk about deplatforming more broadly. When you take a class of people who agree with something that might be wrong, or might be based on misinformation, or might just be sort of contrary to kind of where the conversation is, when you kick them off a platform, they're going to go somewhere else, and they're going to keep having that conversation. And in some cases, that conversation might get much more intense. It might be much more driven by animosity. It might be angrier, and fundamentally, it makes some of these topics taboo. If they're really wrong, well, let's hash it out. It's not to say that we have to, put every January 6th participant on the debate stage so they can air their views, but it does sort of mean that you kind of have to let them talk. There's no benefit we get really from sort of kicking people out of the public square and hoping they just kind of shut up about it. It just doesn't work that way.
Well, look, it's a fascinating report, and I think that, why can't we all get along might be a bit too ambitious and trite, but why can't we all have it out and talk about it as adults, I think should certainly be the goal here. The report, which has been commissioned by the Public Policy Forum, comes out tomorrow. You can read it. It's called Far and Widening: The Rise of Polarization in Canada, written by freelance journalist Justin Ling. Justin, this was an absolute delight. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.